The viewpoints expressed on Night Fright are not necessarily those of the host, the staff, the sponsors, or the affiliate stations. Tonight's program may contain graphic themes or images. Viewer discretion is advised.
There is a time for question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Showtime. Welcome to the show. I'm Brent Holland, and welcome everybody to Night Fright. Kick back, get in your most comfy chair, get the coffee going, the tea going, or a beverage of your choice. Wonderful show for you tonight. Larry Hancock is joining us all the way from Oklahoma, where he's in a power outage, and he's been in a power outage for several days now, but his phone is working miraculously. So he's joining us tonight. He's being a super trooper, and he's virtually sitting in the dark, folks, and we're going to lighten up his life tonight. We're going to be talking.
I could use it.
Yeah, no kidding. We're going to be talking about Benghazi tonight, and September 11th, 2012, in Benghazi, Libya. Something very, very unexpected happened, or perhaps it was expected, and nobody really moved to do anything about it. And we're going to be talking about that tonight. And of course, those were the attacks that took place at the embassy, and also later on at the CIA annex, which was approximately a mile away from the embassy. And we're going to be examining why that CIA annex was placed a mile away from the embassy as well tonight. As fans of this show will know, I had Chris Peranto on several weeks ago now, and he was talking about his new book, 13 Hours in Benghazi, and he was a first-person witness there. He was part of the team, the CIA annex team, that went in and tried to get Ambassador Stevenson out, and some of the other folks there that were there. They did manage to get a few of them out. They went back to the CIA annex a mile away, as I said. Then they were attacked by some terrorists, and we're going to be looking at all the ins and outs of this. Who knew what, when, where, and how. Larry, thank you for joining us, first of all.
Oh, happy to be here.
And folks, I should tell you, Larry, of course, is one of the most reputed researchers, not only in the JFK assassination realm, but period. He is one of the best researchers ever to put pen to paper. And if you're looking for some great books, look no further than Larry Hancock, and just go to www.nightfrightshow.com, and all his books will be there. And Larry, of course, has been on the show umpteen times, and all his shows are in the archives as well. We talk about subjects in the archives ranging from JFK to the CIA and assassination squads, to one of the best books